Welcome back to Key Safety Talks, everyone. Ready for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling chemical safety and hazard communication.
You know those labels and safety data sheets you see?
Yeah, exactly, the HCS and GHS.
Well, those are what we're going to be breaking down today.
By the end of this, you'll be able to spot the differences between the two.
And know why they even matter in the first place.
Most importantly, how this knowledge can help keep you safe.
We'll be covering everything from those labels
To the safety data sheets.
training requirements.
And even how these systems impact global trade.
Buckle up.
Let's kick things off with a little something that might surprise you.
Did you know that the U.S. and most of the world have different approaches to how they assess chemical hazards?
Interesting.
It's true. The U.S. uses HCS, which relies on a performance-based approach.
So what does that mean?
Well, basically, manufacturers have some flexibility in how they evaluate and classify the hazards of their chemicals.
So they have guidelines, but they ultimately get to decide how risky something is.
Yeah, like an open book test.
They need to show their work, but they can get to the answer however they want.
A great analogy. Now compare that to GHS, which is more standardized.
More criteria-based.
Yeah, think of it like a recipe where everyone has to follow the same steps and use the same ingredients.
So GHS is all about making sure that everyone classifies chemical hazards the same way.
Exactly. GHS gives specific criteria and definitions.
Even testing methods to make sure those chemicals are classified consistently around the world.
Now that brings up an interesting question.
Which is?
Well, is one system safer than the other? More flexibility could mean more room for error.
But stricter rules like with GHS could lead to unnecessary precautions.
Exactly. It's a debate that's been going on for ages.
What are the pros and cons?
Well, the flexibility of HCS can be helpful sometimes.
How so?
It can be adapted to different industries.
But it also leaves room for underestimating the hazards.
Yeah, which puts workers at risk.
A company might just downplay the risks so they don't have to deal with regulations or labeling requirements.
It's definitely possible.
So GHS is stricter, but at least it's more consistent.
And that reduces the risk of underestimation, but it could also lead to overclassifying some chemicals.
Even if they're not that risky in the real world.
Right.
Is there any evidence that one system is safer?
It's tough to say.
Why?
There have been studies, but there are just so many other factors.
Like a
Training programs.
safety culture?
And how regulations are enforced.
So we can't just say one is better,
It's more complicated than that.
but at least knowing the differences helps us see the strengths and weaknesses.
And it shows just how important it is to be aware of potential bias.
Regardless of what system is being used.
That's right.
Now let's move on to something we all see pretty regularly.
Even outside of work.
Chemical labels. What are some of the differences between the two systems?
GHS labels are packed with information.
Designed to be easy to understand.
They use those standardized pictograms, those symbols that show you what the hazard is.
Like the flame for flammable stuff.
Or the skull and crossbone.
For toxic substances.
Right. Those are supposed to make you pay attention.
In addition to the pictograms, GHS labels also have those signal words.
Like danger and warning.
So danger is for the more serious hazards.
And warning is for moderate risks.
Got it.
GHS labels also include hazard statements that describe the hazard.
And precautionary statements that tell you how to handle the chemical safely.
So it's basically a mini safety data sheet right on the label.
Now, HCS labels have some of these things too.
But they aren't as standardized or detailed.
Right. They don't have those pictograms, which might make it hard to understand.
Especially if you aren't familiar with the hazards.
And those pictograms are definitely a big help.
Especially when there are language barriers.
Yeah, here's a fun fact.
Okay, let's hear it.
HCS labels can have a black border around the hazard warning, but GHS labels can't.
Interesting. Why is that?
It's allowed under HCS.
But GHS doesn't allow it to keep things consistent and avoid confusion.
Okay, so let's talk about safety data sheets now. Those in-depth documents that tell you all about hazardous chemicals. I'll admit, those can be pretty intimidating.
I hear ya. But they are really important for understanding those hazards.
And how to handle those chemicals safely.
Exactly. And GHS has a structured approach to SDSs.
What do you mean?
It mandates a 16-section format.
So no matter where you are in the world, a GHS SDS will always follow the same structure.
Right. That consistency makes it so much easier to find what you're looking for.
Especially in an emergency.
Exactly. HCS, on the other hand, doesn't have that rigid format.
So the order and presentation can vary.
Right.
So a GHS SDS is like a well-organized filing cabinet, and an HCS SDS is like a jumbled desk drawer.
I like that analogy. And that lack of consistency can make it really hard to compare information.
Especially in a time-sensitive situation.
Right. And it can be a headache for companies that work globally.
Having to create different SDSs for every country.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of companies are switching to GHS, even if they're in the U.S.
Just makes things easier.
It does.
Now, you mentioned 16 sections. Can you give me a quick rundown of what each section covers?
Sure. The first section is all about identifying the chemical.
Like its name and CAS number?
And any synonyms.
Basically just the basics.
Right. Section 2 is hazard identification.
So that outlines the health and environmental hazards.
This is where you'll find those pictograms and signal words.
Okay, a quick snapshot of what the risks are.
Section 3 is the composition and information on ingredients.
So the specific components and their concentrations.
Yeah, this is where it gets more technical.
What about first aid?
That's Section 4.
Outlines the steps to take if you're exposed.
Important for anyone handling chemicals.
At work or even at home.
Right. Section 5 is all about firefighting measures.
Like what you should use to put out a fire involving the chemical.
Exactly. That's more geared toward firefighters and emergency responders.
Makes sense. What about if there's a spill?
That's Section 6, which outlines accidental release measures.
Okay, so what steps to take to contain the chemical and minimize environmental damage?
Right. Section 7 is about handling and storage.
So guidelines for preventing accidents.
Precisely. Then Section 8 is about exposure controls and personal protection.
That's where we get into PPE like respirators and gloves.
Right. Section 9 details the physical and chemical properties of the chemical.
So things like its appearance and boiling point.
Exactly. Section 10 is stability and reactivity.
How stable it is and what it might react with.
Right. Section 11 is all about the toxicology.
So how it can impact our health.
Right. Section 12 is ecological information, so the environmental impacts.
Got it. Section 13 is disposal considerations.
And Section 14 is about transporting the chemical.
Okay, Section 15.
That's regulatory information, so any laws or regulations.
Okay, and 16.
That's other information, so anything else that might be important.
The catch-all section.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of information.
It is, but it's all organized in a way that makes it easy to find what you need.
Now I'm curious about how these systems deal with trade secrets.
That's a great question.
Companies want to protect their information, but workers need to know about the hazards they're dealing with.
Right. It's a tricky area.
So how do these systems balance those things?
Both systems allow companies to withhold certain information on SDSs and labels.
So they can't just say it's a trade secret and not tell us anything.
Right. They need to justify it.
And what counts as justification?
They need to prove that disclosing the information would hurt their business and that there's no other way to protect that information.
Okay, so they can't just hide the fact that something's dangerous.
Exactly. And this is where GHS is a bit better.
How so?
It's more in line with international principles for protecting that information.
So if a company is working in a global market, they might be better off using GHS.
Right.
Can we walk through an example?
Sure.
So let's say there's a company that makes a special kind of paint that's really resistant to scratches.
Okay.
And they've got this unique chemical formula that they consider to be a trade secret.
So they want to protect their recipe, but they still need to comply with regulations.
Right? Under GHS, they could use a generic name on the label.
Instead of disclosing the actual chemical.
Like they could say proprietary resin blend.
Right, but they still need to tell you what the hazards are.
So if it's flammable, they can't hide that.
Right. They can protect their trade secret, but they can't hide the danger.
So GHS gives you a good way to balance transparency and business interests.
It does.
Now, what about HCS?
It lets you protect trade secrets, too.
Good.
It's not as well-defined or consistent with international principles as GHS.
So a company might run into more issues trying to protect its formula and comply with regulations.
Especially if they're working globally.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about labels and SDSs.
The basics of HCS and GHS.
But there's so much more to explore.
Like the scope of these systems and why they even matter to you.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back to dig deeper into the world of hazard communication. So we've talked about the nuts and bolts of these systems, HCS and GHS, but now I want to step back a bit. You mentioned that GHS has a wider reach than HCS. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So HCS really just focuses on the workplace.
But GHS is more global.
Right. It wants to harmonize hazard communication across the entire world.
So that impacts consumers at home.
People transporting chemicals.
And even emergency responders.
Exactly. Chemicals are constantly crossing borders these days, so having GHS just makes it easier to handle them safely,
From start to finish.
no matter where that chemical ends up.
Like a universal language for chemical
Exactly. It streamlines international trade, and it also helps emergency responders.
How so?
Imagine a chemical spill from a cargo ship in a foreign port. First responders from all over need to be able to work together.
Even if they don't speak the same language.
Right. Clear communication is so important in those situations. It can be a matter of life or death.
And GHS helps make sure everyone has the same information.
Exactly.
This global harmonization sounds great in theory, but how does it actually work?
Well, most countries implement GHS gradually.
So they don't just switch over overnight.
Right, they might start with the labels and then slowly incorporate other things like the SDS format and training requirements.
So that gives companies time to get up to speed.
Exactly.
What kind of impact has this had on businesses?
For companies that work internationally, it's been huge.
How so?
It simplifies everything they don't need to make different labels and SDSs for every country.
That saves a lot of time and money.
It really does. And it shows that they're committed to safety, which is good for their image.
So there are real business benefits.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Now, what about enforcement? How does that work?
It depends on the country.
So there's no global GHS police.
Not really. Some countries have laws that enforce it, while others have industry standards or voluntary programs.
And I'm guessing the penalties for not following the rules vary too.
Yeah, they could get a warning, a fine, or even have their permits suspended.
So companies need to take this seriously.
They do.
Okay, so let's talk about training. We said that GHS training is more detailed than HCS training. What does that actually involve?
Well, it focuses on making sure employees can understand and use the information on the labels and SDSs.
So they need to know how to identify the hazards and how to handle the chemicals safely?
Right. It's not just about reading a document. It's about knowing how to apply that knowledge.
So it could have helped prevent some of those major industrial accidents.
It's hard to say for sure, but clear communication is so important.
Think about the Bhopal disaster.
That was a terrible tragedy.
There were so many things that went wrong, but communication breakdowns were a big part of it.
Workers weren't trained properly, and the community wasn't informed about the risks.
So having a system like GHS could have made a difference.
It's possible it could have helped prevent something like that from happening.
It's all about preventing these tragedies and protecting lives.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about actually implementing GHS. It can seem overwhelming for some companies.
I understand that.
Where do they even start?
A good place to start is with a gap analysis.
What's that?
Basically, you look at your current practices and compare them to what GHS requires.
So you figure out where you need to make changes.
Right. That helps you create a plan.
And once you know what needs to be done, what are the next steps?
Well, you need to update your labels and SDSs.
And make sure your employees are trained.
Exactly. It can be a lot of work, but there are resources to help companies.
Like software and consultants.
Right.
A lot of companies are hesitant to switch because they think it'll be too expensive or complicated.
I get it, but I think they should see it as an opportunity.
An opportunity.
Yeah, it can actually make things easier and save them money in the long run.
And of course, it makes things safer.
Exactly.
What about technology? What role does that play in all of this?
Technology is becoming more and more important in this field.
In what ways?
There's software that can help companies manage their chemicals, generate labels and SDSs, and even track training.
So it can automate a lot of the work.
Exactly. It also helps reduce errors,
And some companies are even using technology to make training more engaging.
like online platforms and mobile apps.
So workers can access information whenever they need it.
Right. It's much easier than trying to find the right information in a huge binder.
Makes sense.
And it can even make training more fun with quizzes and simulations.
So technology is really changing the way we approach hazard communication.
It is. And I think we'll see even more innovation in the years to come.
Okay, so let's talk about risk assessment.
Okay.
How does that relate to hazard communication?
Well, it's all about identifying and controlling hazards in the workplace.
So you're trying to prevent accidents from happening in the first place.
Right.
And you need to know about the hazards to do that.
Exactly. That's where hazard communication comes in.
So those labels and SDSs are important for risk assessment too.
They are.
What are some of the different types of risk assessments?
There are a few. One is the job safety analysis, or JSA.
What's that?
You break down a job into steps and identify the hazards for each step.
So if you're working with a chemical, you figure out what could go wrong at each stage.
And then you figure out how to control those risks.
Okay, and are there other types of risk assessments?
Yeah. Companies might also do assessments for the entire facility.
So they look at all the chemicals and processes and the layout of the building.
Right. Those can be pretty complex.
So once you've done the risk assessment, What's next?
You need to figure out how to control those hazards.
Like what?
Well, the best way is to eliminate the hazard altogether.
But if you can't do that,
Then you look at other options like engineering controls, administrative controls, or PPE.
can you break those down a bit?
Sure, engineering controls are about changing the workplace itself.
So like installing a ventilation system.
Right. Administrative controls are about changing the way people work.
So training them on how to handle chemicals safely?
Exactly. And PPE is the last line of defense things like respirators and gloves.
Okay, so you want to eliminate the hazard if you can, but if not, you have other options.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about emergencies.
Okay,
No matter how safe we try to be, accidents can still happen.
that's true.
So what do we need to do to be prepared?
We need to think about what could go wrong.
So like a worst case scenario,
Yeah. And then we need to come up with plans for different types of emergencies.
like chemical spills or fires.
Right. Those plans should tell people what to do to contain the hazard and protect everyone.
And who do we need to contact?
You'd probably need to call the fire department hazmat teams and the police.
So it's important to have a plan in place.
And to make sure everyone knows what to do.
Communication is key in an emergency.
It is.
What are some of the challenges with communication during an emergency?
Making sure everyone has the right information.
And that everyone is working together.
Exactly.
Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about incident investigation.
Okay.
So what's the purpose of that?
It's about figuring out why an accident happened so we can prevent it from happening again.
Not about pointing fingers.
Right.
So what do you do during an investigation?
You secure the scene, gather information, interview witnesses, and look at any evidence.
Trying to figure out what happened.
Exactly. And then you try to figure out the root causes.
What are root causes?
They're the underlying reasons why the accident happened.
Not just the immediate cause.
Right.
So how does hazard communication fit into all of this?
Well, you might look at the labels and SDSs to see if they were clear enough.
And you might check if workers were trained properly.
Right.
Now let's talk about the future of hazard communication. Where do you think this is all headed?
I think we'll see more global harmonization as more countries adopt GHS.
So a more unified approach.
Exactly. And I think technology will play a bigger role.
Like with those virtual reality simulations we talked about.
Yeah. And artificial intelligence could also be a big help.
How so?
It could scan labels and SDSs and pull out important information.
Or translate them into different languages.
Right. It could even help us predict hazards before they happen.
Wow, so the future of hazard communication is pretty exciting.
It is. There are a lot of possibilities.
All right, as we wrap up our look at HCS and GHS, let's bring it all home. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
But why should our listeners care about all of this?
Because you're probably surrounded by chemicals right now.
What do you mean?
What did you use to clean your bathroom? Or what's in that air freshener you like?
Chemicals are everywhere.
They are, and that's why this is so important.
Because
It helps you understand the risks so you can make informed decisions about the products you use.
so I should be reading those labels and SDSs.
You should. You need to know what to look for.
Okay, so let's say I'm at the store trying to pick out a cleaning product.
Okay.
There are so many options. How can I make a safer choice?
Look for those GHS labels with the pictograms.
Those tell me what the hazards are, right?
Exactly. Like if you see the corrosive symbol, you know it could burn your skin.
Okay, so those are my red flags.
And then you can look at the signal words and hazard statements.
Danger is worse than warning.
Right. And if you want more information, you can always ask for the SDS.
Or look it up online
Exactly.
so I can be a safer shopper.
You can.
What about if I'm a teacher doing a science experiment with chemicals
Well, you should always review the SDS before you start.
to make sure I understand the risks?
Right. And make sure your students know about the hazards, too.
So we're all on the same page.
Exactly. You're teaching them about safety and responsibility.
Important life skills.
They are.
Okay, what if I'm doing a project at home and using something like paint stripper,
Make sure you wear your PPE.
goggles, gloves, the whole 9 yards?
Right. And work in a well-ventilated area.
So I'm following those precautionary statements.
You got it. And if you spill something, check the SDS for how to clean it up.
Okay, because different chemicals need to be handled differently.
Exactly.
Now, what about kids? How do we teach them about chemical safety?
Start early and keep it simple.
So basic rules like don't touch.
Right. And as they get older, you can explain things in more detail.
Those pictograms are probably helpful.
They are. You can even make it fun by having them match the pictograms to products.
So it's not just a boring lecture.
Right. And encourage them to ask questions.
so they can learn about this stuff safely.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we go, I want to leave everyone with something to think about.
Okay.
Think about a time when you saw a confusing chemical label or SDS.
Okay.
What would you change about it to make it better?
That's a great question. We can all make hazard communication better.
I agree. Well, I wanted to thank you for joining us today and sharing all of your knowledge.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Key Safety Talks.
Remember, knowledge is power. Stay safe out there.
We'll see you next time.